I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
I'm Frank Hutchison.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And welcome to the Hidden History of Business podcast.
So today we'd like to talk about disruption. Now, disruption is a big buzzword right now.
So buzzy.
Disruptive innovation. You'll see that everywhere. Everyone wants to be disruptive. But it's really interesting when you start digging into what that really means, the way that we're using it nowadays. So every January, there is what's called the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's a global consumer electronics and consumer technology trade show, and it is huge. So every January, there are all these articles that come out that talk about the 5 most disruptive innovations at the CES for this year. And so we looked at the one for this past January, 2015. And what you find when you look at the 5 most disruptive innovations is that they're not really all that disruptive.
How so?
Well, according to Clay Christensen, who kind of authored this idea, a disruptive innovation is one that fundamentally changes the status quo. It's not just in a niche, it's just not a single company or even a single industry, but it fundamentally changes the way that we do things. So when you look at the list, this is from Forbes.com, of the 5 most disruptive innovations that were at CES this past January, you find things like autonomous vehicles.
Like drones and things like
and
that.
Cars.
Okay.
The Google car.
Yeah. Absolutely, that can drive themselves. And the quantified self, which is a fancy way of basically saying body sensors, like the watches that take your pulse and whatnot.
Fitbits and things like that.
Exactly. Number 3 was 3D printing and robotics. Number 4 is the Internet of Things. When you have different appliances, for example, that have internet ability on them.
So you can control them from wherever you are.
Right, exactly. Your home security system, your lights, your whatever. And number 5 was augmented reality, which is everything from virtual reality goggles and earphones to superimposed displays out of a car window, the Google goggles. What are those called?
Google Glasses.
Google Glasses, that's what they're called. And while all of these are definitely innovations, I don't think it's accurate to call them particularly disruptive. They're incremental improvements. They certainly might change an industry. They might change the direction a certain company would choose to go, but they don't fundamentally change the way that we do things.
Well, we see this a lot. It's actually been one of our big frustrations working with startups is that the idea of disruption and innovation has really been made smaller and smaller over the years. And I love, I know we talk about James Burke of Connections and The Day the Universe Changed a lot, but I really love how he explains this approach that people tend to become experts in highly specialized fields, learning more and more about less and less. Unfortunately, so much specialization falsely creates the illusion that knowledge and discovery exist in a vacuum, in context only with their own disciplines, when in reality, they're born from interdisciplinary connections. Without an ability to see these connections, history and science won't be learnable in a truly meaningful way, and innovation will be stifled. And I think we're really seeing that innovation is stifled because we've turned, we just put out the iPhone 6. Or, for instance, drones. I mean, drones really are another kind of remote control. We've turned that into this giant innovation, this huge disruption, when really it's just slightly different within a very small industry.
And I think one of the words in that James Burke quote that really encapsulates the difference to me is that context.
Let me reread that quickly. Okay. It says, unfortunately, so much specialization falsely creates the illusion that knowledge and discovery exist in a vacuum, in context only with their own disciplines.
Yes.
Right. And what we need to look at is the context outside of a single discipline, like interdisciplinary, like James Burke was saying. The innovation itself may not be particularly disruptive in and of itself. It's in context with social, economic, technological, political environment that it's in where it can really be disruptive, and how we can determine it's really disruptive.
It's not just what Silicon Valley says disruption is.
Right.
Well, and a great example of that was the invention of the automatic phone switching system. It was done by an undertaker.
Right.
Not by an electronics engineer or electrical engineer or a telephone engineer. It was done by an undertaker because his competitor's wife ran the switchboard.
I remember
and he had to come up with with a solution, and it was let people dial the number and go directly to whoever they wanted to.
Rather than having the wife funnel all of the people looking for a caretaker to her husband.
Yes.
And it's interesting. There's a wonderful book called 6 Innovations That Made the Modern World by Stephen Johnson, and he talks about how these really world-changing innovations happen and how we tend to overlook them. And many times they're not done by people who were in these disciplines completely. They were done through interdisciplinary connections. For instance, he talks about people like John Leal, John Snow, not that John Snow, and Ellis Chesbrough, who helped create drinkable water from a tap so people wouldn't die from cholera anymore. And they aren't famous. He says they didn't become rich, and we're completely indebted to their work. I find myself really drawn to these folks, he says. They're the kind of heroes we need to celebrate as much as the Mark Zuckerbergs and Steve Jobs. The other thing he points out in his book is that you have these inventors like Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville, who actually invented recorded audio 20 years before Edison's phonograph. And that was a big deal. Being 20 years ahead of your time was unheard of, really, when you look at the other inventions in the 1800s. One of the problems he had is that he was really interested, he was a printer, he was interested in transcribing and coding, so he figured out how to record audio, but not how to play it back. He figured that people would learn how to read the scribbles on these cones he'd recorded like people can read musical notation.
Or shorthand.
Or shorthand, exactly, which is why the innovation didn't really end up taking off. But this is another person who had a hobby. He talks a lot about how people who had hobbies were the ones who really tended to find new innovations because they were dealing with different disciplines. He lists 6 specific innovations that changed the world, and they weren't what I would have thought of off the top of my head. He talks about glass, cold, sound, clean, time, and light. Glass giving us things like actually being able to see when you have bad vision, microscopes, better windows, all sorts of innovations. Things
or bottles.
Like, exactly,
just like
bottles.
Bottles are like the first application of glass, because now you can store things and seal them up.
He talks about cold refrigeration, what a change that had on society. Sound, being able to record and transmit sound over long distances, all the way up to using radar in modern age. Germ theory, simple things like hand washing, which we'll discuss in a minute. And time, which we'll also discuss, and light. Emily, you wanted to talk some more about the real disruptive innovations in the medical industry over time.
Well, and it would be impossible to cover all of them.
Right.
But we've already mentioned a couple of them. Well, you did, Meredith. Refrigeration was a huge disruptive technology that you might not think off the top of your head had anything to do with health or the medical field, but when you have food that you can preserve by refrigeration easily, you have a decrease in foodborne illnesses.
And what's also important is that you have food longer. One of the big arguments for rural electrification back in the 30s was so that people in the South and in the rural areas would be able to butcher their hogs or steers or whatever, and they'd be able to store the meat. They didn't have to eat it immediately.
Right. And it also makes it easier to eat more nutritiously year-round when you have this reliable source of healthy food.
It also greatly decreased, we talk a lot about increased sodium in our diet now, but back when they had to salt all of their meat heavily to preserve it,
right.
The amount of salt people were consuming was incredibly high. And I mean, before modern refrigeration, they were using ice blocks in many cases.
That sometimes they had to shift literally thousands of miles to use.
What are some other medical innovations?
Well, you also mentioned safe tap water. Still, today, clean water is not accessible to everyone around the globe. But you find when you are able to bring clean water to different locations, there is an immediate increase in health and decrease in illnesses, like cholera, for example. That is a huge innovation. Just simply clean water that we so often take for granted. Another fascinating innovation in the medical field was back in the mid-1800s with Dr. Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian physician who was disturbed by the fact that women who gave birth in hospitals died at 3 times the rate of women who gave birth at home.
What were they dying of?
Generally, it was called childbed fever, and they had no idea where this came from. They didn't know why hospitals were more prone to this than women who gave birth at home. So he started doing some research, he started doing some experiments, and he realized that simply having doctors wash their hands decreased the rate of mortality significantly. And so he started trying to encourage his compatriots, his peers, to do this, but it was so foreign to the medical thought at the time that he was basically laughed out of the field, which is really quite a shame. He died at the age of 47 in an insane asylum, but this was one of the first inklings of germ theory. Didn't know that was what was necessarily causing childbed fever, but he saw the correlation that if you wash your hands, specifically he said with this chlorinated lime solution, the rate of deaths went down significantly.
Well, it's because childbirth fever is actually a form of sepsis. It's an infection that women get during childbirth because of people handling them with unclean hands.
And a lot of these doctors were actually going from carving up cadavers to going into the maternity ward because they were busy.
Well, I remember reading about Semmelweis that at this time, people were trying to come up with reasons why this was happening. At some points, they theorized that it was because priests were walking through the maternity wards and ringing the bells was scaring women, which was causing them to get ill and die. It was a huge, blight on society. Women have been dying of pleural fever for millennia, and solving that problem in a very competitive market for birth really would have given someone an advantage and saved so many lives.
Well, and eventually, of course, it did catch on, but it took quite a while. It took several decades before that was recognized as a legitimate way to reduce maternal mortality in hospitals. But another medical innovation that is huge, I think one of the greatest innovations in the past, 50, 60 years is inoculations and vaccinations. Those have saved millions of lives across the globe. We've practically eradicated diseases like smallpox and polio and whatnot.
And
I actually just heard they have a new vaccine out for dengue fever that kills 20 to 25,000 people a year. They have a vaccine for it now.
Which is amazing. And before we actually had the ability to mass produce vaccines and replicate them, they did have inoculations. I mean, especially when we grew up Emily and I grew up in Virginia near Colonial Williamsburg. And I remember going to interpretive presentations where they discussed how inoculations were handled in colonial America. Whenever smallpox broke out, they would actually go cut open a sore and remove the pus from it, either from someone who had suffered from smallpox or from cowpox. And they would actually cut people's arms, and they would rub some of that pus into the cut because they didn't know why it worked, but they just had discovered that people who came into contact with that tended to either get a much less severe case of smallpox or didn't catch it at all. So inoculations had existed. They didn't know what it was. And germ theory really helped them understand how to take this to the next level and save millions, millions, millions of people.
As you can see, these were not incremental changes. These were fundamental shifts in how people in the field and outside the field thought about health and sanitation.
And they saved lives. They had a huge, measurable impact on the way we live.
It's a lot like James Burke's book, The Day the Universe Changed.
Yes.
It caused the view of the universe to change. When doctors realized germs existed and could be transmitted, and even better yet, could be killed by washing, then the universe changed for people. It got to the point where, hey, if you went to the hospital, it wasn't to go there to die, but to live.
Well, it also gave people a sense of control over something that seemed inexplicable. One of the other examples we have of truly disruptive technology is time. Now, in the past, people measured time based off of the sun and the days and the years. I mean, we've had sundials, we have had methods of measuring time going back millennia. As we moved into the more modern age, the ability to measure time became much more precise. And once we moved from being able to measure days to measuring hours, suddenly labor changed because you could pay people based off of hours and value time as opposed to paying someone a day's wage or a yearly wage or a monthly rent. You could actually measure time instead, which gave us more and more precision.
It's really interesting, though, because there wasn't a single unified agreement on what time
There wasn't. It was still very haphazard.
But let me say that some people did actually have a definition of time. Everybody knew what noon was.
Yes.
That was when the sun was directly overhead. They knew what sunset was. They knew what sunrise was. So you had three elements of time that people use to define the day.
But as people tried to find ways to more standardize it, you came up with some very rudimentary inventions to begin with. You had the hourglass, which we've all seen them. There are these two round glass bulbs connected with this little narrow neck, and there's a measured amount of sand particles. And you know that the same amount of sand is going to fall at the same rate over and over again. So that's one way they tried to measure time. Another was a water clock, or a clepsydra. It was this evenly marked container with a little spout, and water would drip out of it. And as the water dripped out of the container, one could note by the water level as it rose the markings of time what it was. In many places they started making standardized candles, and you knew that as the candle burned down to each mark, those were the hours passing. There was a huge advance in the 1300s when mechanical clocks, which were using weights or springs, began to appear. But in the very beginning they didn't even have faces. They didn't have hour or minute hands. Instead they just struck a bell every hour. The whole point was to just let you know, hey, an hour's passed. It wasn't there to tell you where you were in the context of that hour. Later, clocks with hours and minute hands began to come out, and these early mechanical clocks were using this little, it's called an escapement. It's a lever that pivoted and meshed with a toothed wheel at certain intervals, which helped it move. It helped control the movement of the clock. In the 1400s, there was another advance made when they learned that coiled springs, which used these small coiled springs unwinding at a speed controlled by that mechanism, that lever and that wheel, were able to move the hands on a clock as well as weights or springs. That was able to make smaller clocks, and later even watches were possible. Pendulum clocks came in the 1600s, and those were much more accurate than the previous clocks. They used weights and a swinging pendulum to keep the clock moving properly. It was usually off by less than a minute a day compared to the 15 minutes that previous clocks had always been off. The bigger the pendulum, the more accurate the clock was. Finally, this is one of my favorite examples of how time was disruptive. In 1714, the British Parliament said that they would give a cash reward to anyone who could invent a clock accurate enough to use in navigation at sea. Because the British Navy had this huge problem. They had thousands of sailors dying because they couldn't figure out exactly where they were. Because in order to navigate properly, you need to know exact time. That'll help you find where your longitude is, because you're comparing where the sun is, what the time is, to determine where you are on a map. But pendulum clocks don't work at sea because the ship is rocking. For every minute that a clock lost, it meant there could be a navigational error of as much as 15 miles. Now, that's a big deal when you're going through narrow passes, when you're dealing with reefs and rocks. So
or
sailors,
you're trying to find a small island.
Exactly, a very small area. And over time, those 15 miles would compound and compound until people could be thousands of miles off course. And every year, thousands of sailors died because they were lost or smashed against rocks because they couldn't find their exact position. Finally, this is 50 years later. After 4 attempts, a man named John Harrison succeeded in inventing a clock accurate enough to use for sea navigation. And this tiny pocket watch only lost 5 seconds in 6.5 weeks.
Wow.
That was the most. As long as you kept winding it and kept it stable, they could navigate safely. And that changed navigation for, not just the British Navy, but for the entire world, and saved lives. That made a huge difference. You can truly call that disruptive. Finally, we get to the early 1800s, and Eli Terry developed machines, patterns, and techniques to produce clock parts that were standardized so they could be mass-produced and interchanged from one clock to another. So this allowed us to actually create watches and other devices. And this precision led to one of the greatest innovations of our modern age, which was railroads.
The railroads existed, but they had a problem.
Well, they did have... First off, railroads were critical because they allowed people to transport things quickly, and combined with other innovations like refrigeration, they allowed people to get safe food, products, anywhere they needed to go. They also allowed people to travel safely in the heat because of refrigeration as well. But they had this problem. When you have lots of lines intersecting and you have these giant vehicles powered by steam rushing towards each other at 60, 70, however many miles an hour, if they're off by even just a few seconds, they could crash into each other.
Well, and as late as the 1880s, most towns in the United States were on their own local time.
Yes.
That was based on their own local high noon.
Yes.
You could be leaving Cincinnati and arriving in Salt Lake City at a certain time, Cincinnati time, which would be a completely different time, Salt Lake time.
So it could be even a completely different time Ogden time, which is only about 50 miles north of Salt Lake.
Right. When do you actually meet the train? Is it 3 o'clock Cincinnati time, or 3 o'clock Salt Lake time, or Ogden time?
So one of the things that these much more stable clocks that could hold their time longer did is it allowed them to standardize time, because not only could they say, hey, we're all going to use the same brand of clock. A railroad company could order the same ones. They could ensure they were all wound properly. They could also coordinate time across distances. And that led to the creation of time zones.
And I find it very, very interesting that this was spurred by the private railroad companies. It was not the federal government that made this decision. It was the railroad companies that got together and agreed on where the time zones should be, that we should divide the continent into 4 time zones, which actually the divisions that they made are pretty close to what we have today. Not exact, but they're pretty close. So it was the railroad companies that had this problem and came up with this solution that the federal government actually didn't adopt until 1918 as the official time zone.
But it's because the railroad companies had a financial problem when the times weren't standard. People weren't able to make, just on a base level, their customers weren't being able to make their trains know when to get places, but they had a massive safety issue. And it was much easier for them to get together and coordinate and create the system than it was to lose entire engines. As that, we still use that same system. That's how we're able to have flights. It's how we're able to coordinate. Even computers depend on time being coordinated. We all remember the Y2K panic. Time is that important. In fact, we reached the point we can measure time in nanoseconds and beyond, honestly. So because we can measure things in nanoseconds, space travel is possible. We're able to tell when a machine is malfunctioning much earlier and solve problems before they start, because we can detect when something is slowing down, even down to the nanosecond. And you add that up, and that is billions and billions and billions of dollars in saved effort, time, and progress.
Right. That kind of leads to computers, because computers were first designed just to help us do some mathematical calculations. But with the advent of the personal computer, you had people say, hey, this is going to be disruptive. But what's really fascinating is that there was a study done in the 80s that looked at what type of efficiency improvements had occurred. Now, they looked at the growth from manual typewriters to electric typewriters, then from electric typewriters to dedicated word processors, to personal computers with word processing software, then to networked computers, and then to collaborative hardware. And what they found was that the move, like from manual typewriters to electric typewriters, you had an improvement of about 5, maybe 10%.
That's not much.
It's really not. But if you think about it, the improvement came because with electric typewriters, you could type faster. Original design of our keyboard was designed to slow people down. Because if you type too fast,
the little hammers
would get locked up. And I remember, taking typing class back in the 7th grade.
So in the Stone Age.
Yeah, back in the Stone Age when we still use rocks and if you typed too fast, you'd get those jammed up, and then you'd screw up your score because of speed. That was important. Well, electric typewriter did away with that, because it controlled how fast the keys would hit. Another big advance was the IBM Selectric. You didn't have all these arms going, because basically what the electric typewriter first was just a manual typewriter with electric motors.
Okay.
But the IBM Selectric put everything on a little ball, and every time you hit a key, it would spin that ball around and hit the character that you had. What was really nice about that is that you could replace the ball with different balls.
Oh, different
fonts. Like when I wrote my dissertation, not only did you have different fonts, but I had one ball for typing, basically the English language, and I had another ball that had all these scientific symbols. So I could print all of it with a single machine. And I didn't have to go through there and draw things in by hand.
It's the mechanical version of how now we can install different keyboards on our phones and computers for different languages.
Very much so.
Just like I have a Thai keyboard on my computer, and heck, even emojis.
Yes. That was another improvement, about 5 to 10%. Well, then you get to dedicated word processors. Everyone thought, hey, these are fantastic. These are really going to help us be more efficient. But again, they found that it's only about a 5 to 10% improvement.
Why?
Well, it goes back to how difficult it was to make corrections with typewriters. To make a correction with a typewriter, you had to go back and either put a piece of tape over the thing you wanted to correct, or you had like little tapes built into the machine that you could go back and it would cover it up and then take away the ink.
So it was very labor intensive.
It was labor intensive. So people tended to only revise documents maybe twice. In fact, Eisenhower once said that one of the hardest things he had to learn as a general was to sign a bad letter. Because it took too long to get it corrected.
Right.
Oh, that would drive me nuts.
It would.
If there's a typo, I just...
She finds
yes,
it.
because that's how we respond today.
Right.
But part of that is because we had word processing. Now, instead of maybe 2 revisions, we'd have 4 revisions. Because we could keep sending it back to have it changed.
The time changed, because it wasn't more efficient because people could use that extra time to just nitpick and keep
Yes.
improving.
And if you did see a typo, you could send it back. You would send it back because it had to be perfect. Well, now you go from word processing, dedicated word processing machines, to personal computers with word processing software on it. What type of improvement did this provide? Again, 5 to 10%. Why? Because now what you had is, instead of a clerk typist doing your typing for you, which could type very fast, that's what they're trained to do. Who was doing the typing?
You were.
You were. The Pentagon, when it was first built in 1941, when it was completed, it held about 25,000 people. In 1995, it held 25,000 people.
Okay.
So the population number didn't change that much. It was the same size building. The difference, though, was that back in 1941, about 80% of the people that worked in the Pentagon were clerk typists or file clerks.
Wow.
80%.
In 1995, you couldn't find a clerk typist.
Wow.
They just weren't there anymore. You had some people who did typing, their job was typing, but they were executive assistants, and there weren't that many of them. What you had was a lot of people were doing their own typing. And, of course, they weren't as good at it as the clerk typist, so that's why you didn't have that much of an improvement. Plus, it's word processing, so we have to revise even more.
Right.
Then you have the case of, what's the next improvement? Well, the next improvement is, instead of just typing on the machine, and that's where the document resides, now I can take a disk, put in that machine, get an electronic copy, and I can give that disk to somebody else. What did we do before? We printed it out, and then we walked over and gave someone else the document. No longer. When you networked everything, you could send it electronically. So again, you didn't have to walk. But how much of an improvement was that? 5 to 10%.
Because first networking was only intranets. They were internal. We weren't...
Yes.
The internet wasn't or at least our modern internet, was not the first form of networking.
No, it was all internal, and generally it was like dedicated networks, not like we have today. Or they were what they called sneaker nets. You walked the floppy disk from one side to another. And, of course, we got better at that. Well, then finally we got to the point where you had the machines, the networks, and the software that was created where you and I can work on the same document at the same time. So now we no longer actually had to be together to collaborate. That is when you started seeing the real revolution in productivity with word processing and document creation. So that is an example of disruption, but it took time to get there. Because even though you have a new technology, you don't always know how to use it.
That's true, and we were discussing this with movable type, that Gutenberg didn't actually invent movable type. It had existed in China for centuries before that. In fact, woodblock printing was a major art form in Asia for millennia, really. But when movable type was invented in China, it didn't really catch on. It was used by a specific scholar and his followers, and it was very, very stable. It was, they had brass movable type, they had very strong ceramics movable type, but it didn't take off and cause a revolution. Gutenberg's, however, did, because of the social context that he was in.
It's that context
again.
Context matters.
It does. And that's also, it's not just the context around a disruption, it's the fact that disruption can't occur without the right context.
Well, with Gutenberg, of course, the first thing he printed was Bibles. Everybody wanted Bibles, but they were expensive because they were hand-drawn, basically. So he was now able to produce Bibles very cheaply, relatively speaking.
But he didn't just do that. Printing presses began to be used in the very tumultuous religious climate. It began to be used for propaganda, for pamphlets, for competing English Bibles and competing German Bibles. And that led to a surge. That's why it became so revolutionary and disruptive. And I think what we really get out of these stories is that disruption isn't always immediate, and it's not really about the technology. We shouldn't confuse the potential for disruption with actual disruption. When personal computers first came out, they were not disruptive. But now, after, what have we got here, really, of personal computers? We have 30, 40 years, really, of history. Now we can truly say that that technology has been disruptive because of context. So thanks for listening, everyone. If you'd like to learn more about the subject that we discussed today, you can find multimedia content, links to articles we discussed, and videos on our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business and on Twitter as well. Thanks for listening.